activity theory is not Vygotsky, but it's theories that were developed after Vygotsky died. Right? Now, I describe myself as an activity theorist, but there's no activity theorist that I completely endorse. So I'm critical of both A.N. Leontief, who's the sort of father of activity theory, and critical of Yuri Engstrom, who's a modern proponent of activity theory as well. So I'm able to perfectly well explain this concept of activity theory, but for me, I render them in terms that make sense in terms of Vygotsky. Right. So the basic concepts of activity theory are operations, actions, and activities, and I'll get to them one at a time in a minute. Now I've got here activity is a substance, which is, I agree, a funny thing to say, but substance is a technical philosophical word, and it means the basic concept of a philosophy. So in activity theory, everything is activity. All social life, which is what we're interested in, is activity. And remember from what we looked at right back at the beginning of this, activity is not just behaviour, it's behaviour taken together with consciousness or thinking. Right? Now, like for Marx as well, everything was activity. Different from the word activities. Operations, actions and activities are all things that have a beginning, a middle and an end, and you can count them. There may be a hell of a lot of them, but they're basically countable. Whereas activity is just a lot of stuff. Right? It's not something that you count. You just have a lot of it. So we'll go through these concepts. The basic one, which is like the middle one of the three, is actions. And actions are always taken to be implicitly artifact mediated. That is to say, they're either sign mediated, including words, spoken words, or they're tool mediated. Right? But actions are always actions using some means. Even if it's only your own body. For instance, if I slap you on the back, the artifact that is mediating that is my hand. I'm using my body as an artifact and carrying out a culturally conventional gesture of backslapping. Right? If I wave to you, it's again I'm using my body as an artifact, making a culturally conventional gesture. But also when I talk, I'm using culturally meaningful words, which are material things. I know you can't hold them in your hand, but you can record them with a microphone, and even a bit of voice recognition software convert them into text. They're definitely things, material things. Now, how do you know that? How can you isolate an action from the humdrum activity that's going on in the world? An action is directed towards a goal which does not coincide with its motive. Now I've got this little illustration of a guy on a billiard table firing the ball somewhere, but his goal may be, for instance, to cause that red ball to go into a pocket, but that's not the motive. The motive might be to win the game. You can put it back as remotely as you like, to get kudos from his mates that he can pocket that ball so well, whatever. But there's a difference between what's the motivation behind his action and its goal, which is an immediate thing, pop the red. Okay? That's what makes an action. Now, it means actions can sometimes be quite protracted things, like I might go away, this is impossible, go away on a sabbatical for a year to New York, and that will be an action because it wasn't just a question of I have to go to New York for the sake of it. It was to further my career in the department or something. Never been on a sabbatical, never been in such a department, but you understand the idea. Huh? So it doesn't have to be just an instant thing like firing a ball, it can be a protracted thing, but the point is that what a person's actually doing has a certain goal, like get to New York, get an appointment, complete all the required things, and come back again to the job that I left, and a motive which that is serving. And it's that difference. It's the difference which gives it its unity. An action is determined by its goal. That's to say that you might want to get some kudos by that billiard shot, but how you make that billiard shot will depend entirely that the red ball actually goes down the pocket it's supposed to. Right? So how you carry that out is determined by the goal, not its motive. The action is consciously controlled by the subject. So for example, while he's playing that shot, his backside might be going like this, like a cat does when he's looking at a mouse, right? He does his backside. It's charming when cats do that. But that's not being controlled. That's just a bit of behaviour. But for example, the way he's shaping himself up, the way he's balancing, maybe puts his feet far apart, all those kinds of things are consciously controlled in order to get a good shot. And those are all characteristics of an action. And this artifact mediated action, the mediating tools here are the various implements, the cue particularly, but also the ball and the billiard table and so on. The difference with the goal and motive, the fact that the control by the action, but it's controlled by the subject pursuing their goal. Right? So it's consciously controlled by the subject to achieve a goal. Okay, they're the characteristics of an action. Can we just make sure that we've got that concept okay? Roland.
An action is determined by its goal. I'm not quite sure of that.
Okay, well, in a sense, I say it's consciously controlled by the subject, but is
that to say that the goal is what chooses which action, which
for some reason or other the game requires
movement or which thing to do?
Yeah.
Then is the word action wrong there? Should it be that the activity is determined by the goal and then the two being together then cause it to be an action? No,
there's no. I haven't touched on activity here. There's a specific concept as an action. It's true that activity is made up of actions, but the point is to get the action. And the action, which will require the cue to be at a particular angle and to move in a particular way and to stop moving at a certain point, etc. All these things are so as the ball goes down the hole, if that's what the goal is. Okay, so and all those factors that are going to determine whether the ball goes down the hole or not are consciously worked out by the person controlling their body and whatever, so as to achieve that goal. So it's conscious. When I say the action is determined by its goal, consciously. Right? So you take the goal and then you implement an action to achieve that goal. Right?
So yes. You can't have an involuntary action?
No. What's involuntary is not an action.
I was just checking.
Yeah.
Picking up on that question, I think another way that might help to understand it is because that point that you're making about the consciousness is, in a way, the goal is consciousness, like the motive made conscious, like some aspect of the motive made. Do you know what I mean? To then drive action.
Yeah. Whether the person is aware of the motive or not,
they might not be aware of it. Yeah, but it's the format, the goal that comes from that then becomes.
Yeah. Where did the goal come from? Is another question, which sort of, in a way, lies outside understanding what the action is. There's a goal. Where did it come from? That's another question.
And are you going to say, is motive connected to activity?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Just checking where.
Yeah. There are several words around this area. But the thing about activity theory is it's really good on looking at motivation. Right? It's weak in certain respects, but in dealing with why people are doing something, what motivates them to do it, why are they trying so hard, why have they lost interest, all those kinds of questions around motivation are dealt with particularly well by activity theory. I think it's something that you can't quite get out of Vygotsky. Right? For example, Vygotsky will deal with this dual stimulation experiment. A child's trying to do a task. You don't ask why the child is trying to do that task. You know that the experimenter asked them to do it, encouraged them and praised them, so they tried to do it, and then the experimenter offers them a sign to use in completing the task, and it succeeds in completing the task. But it never comes up what was motivating the child to do that anyway. Now, activity theory confronts that problem. The motive comes from outside. It doesn't just well up magically from somewhere inside. It starts from somewhere outside and is acquired by the child or the person, or adult just as much. Okay? So, when you're doing action is something that's consciously controlled. We're not talking about the unconscious things you do. And it's aimed at an immediate goal, what it achieves or fails to achieve, but what you're trying to achieve, which is its goal, but the motive which gives you the goal, like the goal arises in this case sort of from the rules of billiards and a lot of other things in the mix as well. The exact situation, your desire to win, agreements you may have had with your partner, understanding how the opponent plays the game. But basically it arises out of that situation. There's a goal, you need to pot that ball. Okay, leave it to me, I know what to do to pot that ball, and there's your action. Okay. Now, an operation. An operation is like an unconscious action. But there are two different ways an operation can be an unconscious action. If I'm tying up my shoelaces, then I'm not thinking about tying up my shoelaces. I might be thinking, hurry up and do it because I want to get to the loo, I want to get my shoes on, get on with life. Or I might be thinking, God, why am I up at this hour? Or whatever. But I'm not thinking about, first pull this bit of lace together there, then turn that bit of lace over there, use your first finger to... No, I'm not thinking that. That's all happening on autopilot. Right? So mastery of an action leads to it becoming an operation. When a little kid, I remember the first time I succeeded in tying my shoelaces. It was on holiday, we were down the beach, and everyone else had gone out on a walk. My father offered to tie up my shoes so that I could join them, and I said, no, I'm going to do it myself. And I remember running down the street afterwards saying, I did it. Right? But after that, never had to think about tying shoelaces again. So that's what an operation is. Okay? The other thing is, a classic case of an operation is when you're walking down the street and you step over the curb and then step up the curb on the other side and you don't think about it. You could even be reading a book, looking at the corner where you're going, wondering if the shop's still going to be open when you get there, and your feet do these wonderful things. They avoid obstacles, step over holes, whatever. Now, if, for example, when you stepped over the gutter, you misjudged in that subconscious way that's judging, you misjudged in some way, and all of a sudden your foot went down a bit further and threw you off balance. Immediately it springs back into conscious control and becomes an action. Right? So an operation is an action, but it's not consciously controlled. But it's not like, there's not a Chinese wall between an action and an operation. And that action something can be an action one moment, an operation the next, and vice versa. So to be an operation, it's generally a fixed pattern of behaviour, such as tying your shoelaces. And it's adapted to conditions. So for instance, walking, fixed pattern of behaviour. You don't think, first I put my left foot forward, now I put my right foot forward, and then she's singing one of those silly songs. Right? It's just an automated kind of thing. And it's adapted to conditions because the feet kind of automatically just follow the contours of the ground. The subject is not consciously aware. You're not only not controlling what your feet are doing, you're not even aware that you're walking. I mean, if you ask, of course you're aware. Anything happens, your consciousness can go to those feet and know exactly what they're doing. Right? But you're not thinking about it, you're not aware of them, you're not controlling them. What's controlling them is just the goal of the action. If you're walking down the street to get some milk before the milk bar closes, if they have such things, they don't have milk bars any longer, so the 7-Eleven closes, then that's the goal that's determining your feet. Right? Same as the goal of the action. But it's also determined, or the activities theorists would say, it is determined by the conditions. So whether your foot goes like this or whether it goes like that determines where the ground is, determined by where the ground is. Okay? So really what's going on all the time is operations. Okay? And there's just the main thing that we're trying to do at a given instant is our action. What am I doing at the moment? Explaining about an action. Okay, but all sorts of other things are going on at the same time. They're just on the not consciously aware business. But clearly, as you grow up and you learn to pronounce words, to make gestures, to use your body language, to drive cars, to walk fast, slow, hop, and whatever, all these things are becoming part of your psyche. All these little automated operations and operations using things or actions all begin as artifact mediated. So you're taking the properties of these artifacts that you're using into your psyche. When you learn to do them without conscious awareness, for instance, pronouncing a word, when you're pronouncing that word without thinking about it, that word has kind of entered into the depth of your psyche and you're not consciously aware of it. It's there as an ability to say word, whatever. Okay? To use an input, to use a computer, for example. Yeah? All the properties of that computer, its connectedness and its keyboard and everything else, just entered into there, now part of your psyche there. It's just automated things. The converse works as well. Try to deal with this later, hang on. Now, any automated operation, any fixed pattern of behaviour is ripe for automation. So when, for instance, the medical scientists notice that there's a certain sequence of actions that doctors use to diagnose a certain disease, they'll put out a little microchip that does all those tests. Because it's just a fixed pattern of behaviour, and you don't need a human being to do it. As soon as the people at Google have got the act of driving a car, the action of driving a car, down to a fixed pattern of behaviour that can be described in words, then they're going to have a computer to drive your car for you. And I don't think that's more or less the state of, that exists now.
Big trouble.
Yeah, big trouble. Yeah. So the development of technique is going along, like we explained with the stubble spiral before, as we develop our fixed patterns of behaviour using the knowledge and equipment, the things that we've inherited from the past. We develop new fixed patterns of behaviour. They can get put into, since development of computers, much more powerfully than ever before, get put into objects. And so operations can be objectified. Actions can't really be, because the action's driven by what you're trying to do. But as soon as the action has been transformed into an operation, where it's just a fixed pattern of behaviour that's determined by the conditions, so long as you've got, for instance, sensors that can determine the conditions, if it's that type of conditions, then the process can be automated and you can put it into a machine. So when cars were first developed, they probably had someone jumping a belt from one to another to go up hills, one wheel to another, and then you've got a gearbox, so all you have to do is touch this, touch that, and a whole different set of gears come in. Then you've got automatic cars where the car simply changes gear because it picks up what slope you're on, and in the end it's steering, it's doing everything, right? So operation is an interesting concept because, one, it's showing how what you're doing, that's to say your actions, is continually building up and moulding your psyche. It also shows potentially how your actions are passing into the technique and passed on to others through technology and so on. So an object's a fixed pattern of behaviour. The subject is not, at that moment, consciously aware of controlling it. It's determined by its conditions. Okay? Okay, we all seem happy there, that's good. Activities. Now notice the use of the word plural, because in English one way of distinguishing between an activity and activity as a substance, the general substance that we're interested in as activity theorists, is to use a plural, or I can use a definite or indefinite article in front of it. But the word's the same. We had the same issue with experience, different from an experience, or an activity is different from activity. An activity isn't just a general background of business. An activity has an intrinsic motive or object in the sense of objective, which can only be realised socially by many actions. So, for example, publishing a book on activity theory is not something that I can do by myself. In fact, even if I could type it up, print it, and carry it around and put it in all the shops and everything, I can't read it myself. Right? So publishing includes reading. Right? So activities are things that essentially require many actions, may be carried out by the same person. Like first I'll save some money, then I'll buy a house, then I'll move into it, and then I'll renovate it. Right? So it requires planning. 20 years of your life, first 10 years spent saving and so on. Right? So an activity is protracted, and Leontief, who invented all this stuff, he really was very strong on the idea of development. Right? So he looked at the development of the human species in terms of the development of action. That very sort of the lower animals, bugs and amoebas and things, the amoeba doesn't even have actions, it's only got operations. It just is attracted to the higher density of food and it moves that way. And then which way is the density of food going out? You'll go that way. Right? And what Leontief did for a hell of a lot of decades of his life, minutely tracing the development of action from operations right through to activities. So an activity has an intrinsic motive, like for example car manufacture involves thousands and thousands, even maybe millions of people, all for the sake of producing cars. That's the motive. It can only be realised by many actions, and if the action can be divided up into a number of separate detachable bits, then you can have a division of labour. So the development of a division of labour depends on action developing to a point whereby you achieve a distant end through a succession of steps, and then assign each of those actions to different people. So the classic example which Leontief gives is a tribe going on a hunt where they have beaters and chasers. And if you look at the activity of the beater, it's senseless. They're making a lot of noise so that the animal runs away from them. But of course, over the other side of the hill are the chasers there. So the beater's activity, so the beater's actions make sense only in the context of the activity of the whole group, which is catching the animal. And the beaters are part of that because they get a cut of the meat afterwards, even though it's only the guy with the spear at the end that gets to kill the animal. It's divided up. So a division of labour is consolidated, made workable through a distribution of the product. Right? So production, distribution and exchange, or production and distribution at this level, never mind exchange, allow development division of labour, and that's part of the development of activities. Now, someone that's involved in an activity, according to Leontief, is generally aware of the motive of the activity. That's to say, if you work in a car factory, you are aware that the purpose of your activity is to produce cars, even though all you're doing is maybe working on the payroll, in the payroll office, handing out the yeah.
Is there an exception to that? That the subject is aware of the motive?
By the way I expressed it, I sort of implied it wasn't, I was attributing the idea to A.N. Leontief rather than saying it as a fact. I'm sort of implying that they necessarily set in stone, yes. But the idea of it is that they perfectly well could be. But yes, it's true that you could be involved in an activity and not be aware of what the end goal of it is. For example, you might be a soldier and you're told to go along with that troop and take that hill, and have no idea how that fits into the overall strategy, and very likely don't even know what the hell you're fighting the war.
Or even that there's a conscious motive, but maybe an unconscious motive as well.
Okay, haven't got to the point of unconscious motives, but we can do that. It's with unconscious motives that I tend to part company with Leontief. I suppose that's why I haven't even put them on my program. The classic case is a child has some homework to do. Right? The child doesn't want to do their homework. I mean, why should they? It's a sunny day, you want to go out and play. So the tutor is faced with a problem. How can they get the child to do their homework? So they'll say something like, if you do your homework, then you don't have to come in until 7 o'clock and you can stay up for an hour. Okay, I'll do it. So the motive of the child is to do their homework. That is to say, to learn so that they can become an engineer when they grow up and lead a good full life as a useful citizen. But they are not aware of that. And generally speaking, you would not expect a child to understand the true motive of learning. Right? So you hope that the aim of education is not just to get the child to learn the material, but also to embrace the reason for it. Right? But it's a problem that the educator is confronted, how to do it. And that no amount of lecturing them about the need to be a good citizen, and if you don't learn all this stuff and understand it, never mind your exam, that's never going to get you there, right? So there is the fact that a child is simply developmentally not able to grasp the idea that learning their times table is going to contribute to them being a high-paid engineer and owning a big house when they're older. It just doesn't compute, right? So the teacher has to balance that conundrum, and it generally involves the idea that there is the activity that the child is involved in has a personal sense, and yet it also has an objective motive. And this is what I haven't dealt with in the PowerPoint. So, personal sense versus objective motive. So an objective motive is a motive which is actually motivating the activity, but the child's not aware of it. But it's objective, right? Because motives don't come up from the inner soul, and you're not really talking about I'm doing this really because I want approval. That's not what's an object here. The motive is something objective. That's the whole idea of activity theory. The motive actually comes from outside. Now, the personal sense of the thing is not the same as the motive. So, for example, the car worker knows that he's or she's there to build cars, but the reality is that they don't give a stuff about the car. What they're interested in is the pay packet that comes on Thursday night and getting the hell home as fast as possible, maybe stopping at the boozer on the way home. Right? So the personal sense of the work that they're doing on the line is the pay packet, but the objective motive is the building of cars. Now, that's how it's delivered by Leontief, and I have a fundamental problem with that. Right? The way I see it instead is that the child is pursuing an activity, I'm going to put it, all motives are social, you see, that's true, but the social is not homogeneous. Within the so-called society, which is a word I try not to use, there are different classes, different currents of thinking, different communities, and so on, which generate different motives. Right? So there's a certain sense in it when it's applied to the child doing their homework, but because the child can't immediately, there has to be some idea of personal sense and understanding the child's motive. But I want an activity theory which isn't just confined to children. I want an activity theory which understands how adults work. Because the fact is that maybe quite a lot of you might be in the education business or in teaching. You don't change the world by teaching the kids, believe me. You change the world by changing the adults. The children will watch what the adults do and they'll change as well. And they'll overchange them. I'll go past them. Right? But a good social theory, which forms the foundation of education, fundamentally has to understand how adult society works. Right? It's the myth that keeps teachers going, that by fostering all these beautiful kids, the world will be better in future, you know. But give us a break, after all these years, it's not happening, right? The change happens not because the old people do something, but it's that younger group, when they go out into the adult world, how they're motivated or not motivated to change things, the opportunities are. But they might be young adults, and the difference, I mean the big difference between adults who have already been tamed and institutionalised and young adults that haven't yet been nailed down and slotted into their box, right? But they're not children, right? So am I following a bit of a guru in saying this stuff? Anyone know who Miles Horton is? Miles Horton? He ran what's called the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, beginning in 1932. It's still going now, but he died, I think, in the 70s. It was Miles Horton that trained Rosa Parks. He trained the kids that formed SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was training workers in organising 3 years before the AFL-CIO set up the Industrial Organising Committee. And he said this. He said, you know, what I said, he said, oh, this talk that they give you at graduation, you know, when you're leaving school, that you're the next generation, we're going to change the world. I said, a lot of hooey. If I've any saying that you're not going to change anything. But if you want to change the world, you need to change what the adults do. That's I think he was right. And he basically focused on young adults, not institutionalised people, but young adults that were motivated to and able to change the world, old players. Okay, so to get a theory which can cope with, yes, learning, but learning particularly with adults, the basic theory should include an idea not just subjective, personal versus objective, but the trouble I'm likely to go into what I want to do next week, which is why I'm keeping hanging a bit on explaining what it should be. But it has to recognise, you have to get rid of this idea of objective meaning, put it that way. Objective meaning is an idea that was only possible in Stalin's Russia or maybe Hitler's Germany. Right? The meaning of things is not simply objective. It's whose meaning, for what. Right?
So,
yes.
So could it be hierarchical activities instead of like there's an activity which I'm engaging in and I'm aware of the motive of that, but then someone else above me which is taking the fruits of my labour is engaged in a different activity that I'm involved in, but my activity feeds that activity, but I don't know what that is.
What I call nested activity. Yeah. And what you get into really when you analyse that is that there's not such a sharp and obvious line between an action and an activity. Yeah, because when you look at the motive, then you still got to think, well, why? Okay, car industry, the motivation is to build cars, but why? Yeah. And then you say, well, why do you want car? There's actually a higher motive there, isn't there? to make profit for car makers, to build an industrialised society that can, destroy the atmosphere and all that kind of thing. But that's obviously, I'm playing with you there, but there is a motive behind that. And you might be working in a car component factory, and you say the object is to produce car components, clearly meaningless outside of there being a car industry. So when the car industry closes down, so does the car component industry, and so on. That's right. There's still a clear distinction between operation, action, and activity. But it's true, at the level of activity, things are not cut and dry. There are nesting of activities and so on. And that would be part of the thing here. The objective motive applies. There's one meaning for the word, one reason for doing your homework, and we all know what that is. Get on with it. Right, now, you're a child, you don't accept that, so I'll give you a reward. But in the meantime, through working with you and you doing your homework, and we discuss that, and you acquire the meaning of that, then your motivation, your level of motivation will increase. And the teacher aims to get to a point where the child will be self-motivated in the sense that they actually want to do the homework. Right? So, for instance, you said exams, and you know that you're beyond the point of saying you can play till 7 o'clock. Right? You actually say you've got an exam that you want to pass, and you'll get lots of credit and backslaps and things for getting a good mark. That's a high level of motivation. But when youth are working hard for their exams, they readily get to a point where it isn't just a question of passing the exam, they actually do understand the content. So activity theory deals with that. It's not something I really that's suitable for the discussion here, but it deals with the way the motivation can become more and more developed. And the same with this two-spiral kind of thing. Yeah, you can't start off with a motivation that's like fully grasping the import of what you're doing, but it develops. Yes, Vanna?
I have a question. The objective motive, and that makes me to think about Fernando González Rey's work talking about the generative character of psych. And I feel, is this something contradictory to each other? And I just don't really understand. I understand individual, but when I'm linking these two things together, I get confused. I'm
not going to guarantee that the Fernando González Rey's motive of the generative character of science is compatible with Leontief's activity theory. I don't think Rey is, interested in activity theory at all. I gather. I think he's more interested in early Vygotsky, isn't he? And people who the chat, unfortunately, is driven by a certain amount of, competitive sort of discipline competition, and the people that are willing to embrace Leontief and Vygotsky and actually understand the potential dangers of doing that are rare. Right? Mostly people just focus on the psychology, child development kind of stuff with Vygotsky, or they go to Leontief and only touch Vygotsky a little. I think so. I don't know about that. I'm not all that familiar with Rey's work. I've read it, but it doesn't really grab me. So I haven't studied his work very well, I'm afraid. You'll have to find the answer yourself to that. Yes.
It seems in the examples that you've given that there's a development around the understanding of the immediate versus being able to kind of project into long-term goals that would come with development with regards to children. Is that encapsulated within the theory somehow? Like, how does time work?
Yes. Look, my objective is to give you the concepts, right? And the concepts are always a little bit sort of cut and dry, right? And that's the idea of a concept, and definitely what's being referred to by this. And generally I do, yes, activity theorists are very interested in the development of motivation. And there's some very good people in that area that are dealing with very alienated kids and how to get them interested in reading. Never mind teaching them to, getting them to take notice of that. That's a typical problem for activity theorists to tackle. But I'm not the person to teach you about that, because I'm not an educationalist. And, you know, one really needs to have a grounding in that whole discipline to talk about that. But I recommend learning these concepts of activity theory will be a good, what do you say, arrow in your quiver or something for that, tackling that task. Okay, and Russell's nodding to that as well, I think, yeah. But so you accept the motive for a young child cannot be driven by the ultimate end, but it's different from what the immediate goal is. So that's the basic point. The final motive of what you're doing isn't what directs you to achieve the immediate goal. So that's the basic concept. And once you recognise the difference and you grasp through your understanding of children the conception of a far distant societal level goal is beyond the child, then you're dealing with the issue of setting up motives that the child can grasp and how those motives will change through the practice of doing the work that you've set them. Yes, Gavin?
I'm more interested in workplaces.
Yeah.
So, and you're saying we need to get rid of the objective is whose aspect of society, sort of like which aspect of society is determining that. In a workplace, could that not be determined by, for instance, the policies and procedures that the sort of laid down as this is what thou shalt do? Yeah. Could that not be the objective then? Yeah. You put forward to work in that kind of way?
Yeah, well, if you lived in an administered society, then that would be quite unproblematic, wouldn't it? That if there was any question about something, the political committee will pass a directive on the thing and the matter will be settled. But in the world we live in, we know that the senior management in a firm and the middle management and the base level employees and the union reps have probably got 4 different positions about how to deal with a hazard in the workplace. Yeah? The senior boss will be all for following the letter of the law and so on, because you'll delegate the task of making it happen to someone else. This doesn't want a lawsuit. The next manager down will be, I'm just making up scenarios, but there are different social positions involved there, yeah? and so they'll have a different position. The same that if there's a gender issue around someone, you start talking about objective motive. I mean, whose motive? Is it the male motive or the female motive? Well, let's start off by recognising that there may be different motives there. There's no objective motive. This particular course of action will benefit one group of people, or not necessarily benefit, that's a crude way of looking at it, but aligns with the world view or attitudes of this group. Another course of action will align with a different set of points of view. And I think that if the only opposite to objective is personal sense, then what it means is it's like anyone who doesn't agree with what the political committee says, they're a dissident. Right? So dissidents are individuals that hold a different point of view. The objective position, that of the state, is set down in writing in law and is clearly understood by everybody, or ought to be. Right? If you have a different opinion. So there is a problem with activity theory, and it's been mixed up with the history of the society out of which it came. And I mean, one needs to just be aware of that. It grew up in an absolutely Stalinised society. That doesn't mean to say it's all useless at all. It's actually it's a theory I choose to embrace as my own. Right? But it has these problems, and it comes up with this polarity of personal versus objective. There has to be an allowance that there are many motives, that not just personal, but genuine social motives that conflict. Yes, Robert?
How about instead of objective, if you said like administered motive? An administered motive, so someone is administering a motive. Yeah. It's not their personal motive, but it's something that's...
Yeah, look, it's not going to be changed. Yeah, I understand. It's still like the issue with nesting as well. Look, the objective alludes to subjective objective, very basic categories of psychology that we sort of started this whole course with. and that's the view, and it's handled there. And I think to not go down that road where a motive is either the personal sense driven by what your less developed motives, like the wage worker, whose personal sense of something is just get their wage. They're obviously, they're not fully integrated into society if they think that. The good Subotnik would be motivated to repair the railway line and wouldn't care about getting a wage, right? So if persons, insofar as person differs from objective, it's just like the difference between the personal and the true. Yeah? So
the subject, and it goes back to the issue of time, that's where the historicity comes in. It's the subjects, when they, from moving from motive to goal, it's how the subject reads. It's not detached from them and administered. They'll read. So if we're playing billiards and it's about looking like the winner or whatever, that's what they don't want to lose face. The way I might see my next goal, and you and Patra and different people see the next goal, is the subject and the activity coming together, creating the goal, and then you see the action. So I'm just surprised that.
Yeah, well, I think there's a problem that Leontief's theory is really based on binary oppositions to it.
But the dialectic is there all the time, I thought.
Yeah.
Subject in, but mind in society.
Yeah. And saying he has virtues as well, that's true. The developmental aspect is there, but there are also problems, and I think this problem of a subject-object relation is not in itself sufficient. It's a great relation, of course. Subject-object is a classic dialectical relation, but the way we cognise the world isn't just individual subject and a world. We cognise the world through social relations. They're mediated, so that how do I cognise the world? Well, through concepts that I acquire socially. How do I acquire them? Through specific activities, attached to the social position I have. So there is certainly an objective world there, but the way the relation, my as an individual subject, in the way I relate to that objective world, what is universal, is mediated by social relations, by activities, by motives.
Exactly.
In fact, yeah.
I'm surprised that
that's
to hear it put the other way.
Yeah, I've never found anything in the Leontief that suggests that he's got an answer to this. For example, there's distinction between sense and meaning as well. Meaning is taken to be non-psychological, it's objective. Like you look it up in the dictionary or you ask an expert, that's the meaning. And the sense it has for you, well, that's subjective. But again, that's not adequate.
I know that you're not going to talk about Engerstrom's activity theory.
I am actually.
A little bit. But I'm just wondering, is that next week?
Next week.
Oh, okay, then maybe I'll ask it next week.
Yeah.
The only question I've got is what you see as the weakness. Like what has led you to focus more on the Leontief tradition of activity? But maybe
I don't. I wouldn't say I focused on the Leontief theory.
you seem much more drawn to it then.
Yeah, I suppose so. The basic. The things only go as far as the basic concepts, and they're the same basic concepts on which Engstrom has constructed his theory. So he described himself as a third generation. So I'm grasping the first generation and say Vygotsky, not in total, but in the whole crew, Vygotsky is the genius in the crowd, right? He made mistakes. He had only 10 years of a working life, and it took him about 7 of them to get his act together. So, but he's the genius in the crowd. Then Leontief was the second generation. He made important developments of Vygotsky, but he didn't really grasp the method. I'd say he didn't grasp the method that was contained in Vygotsky's work. And there were problems in developing a theory that's in part a social theory in the Soviet Union. You can't do that, right? Any more than you can build a opposition political party in the Soviet Union. Engstrom actually corrected some of those deficits, but I think the methodological foundations are seriously in question by the time, but also I'll appropriate things from Engstrom as well. I think the whole stuff about germ cell is sort of 80-90% right. Good. This the work research I don't go along with really at all. Okay. But so I think I explained at the beginning of this. I can only give you my interpretation, and that's why I'm trying to restrict myself to the basic concepts. A lot of the interpretations I give are not embraced by everyone, and a lot of them have been subject to variation over the decades. But I'll try, when I do tell you something that's a bit off centre, I'll give you a signal that this is the case. And that's 8 o'clock. Okay. Thank you very much. I'll give you just, what are we going to do next week? So next week we're actually doing a kind of compare and contrast of those 3 generations. So again, we'll pick up next week exactly where we're leaving off here. Okay.